Hello and welcome to the Metabolic Classroom. I'm Professor Ben Bikman, a biomedical scientist and professor of cell biology. Today, we are exploring oxalates. These are natural compounds found in many plants. And despite what we always think about plants and often hear about plants, these can harm the body in various ways. We're going to discuss where oxalates come from, how they can act as anti-nutrients. That sounds kind of controversial, which is great. Controversy always generates interest. And we're going to examine the potential effects that they have on the kidney, especially. The kidneys are very susceptible, as well as the gut and heart function. So mostly that's actually blood vessels. But also I want to mention how they affect our joints, which is not something you often hear about. At the end of it, we're going to have a little bit of the good news when it comes to oxalates, and then just discuss briefly some strategies to help manage oxalate intake, and even mention some unexpected sources. All right, so let's dive in. By way of setting the stage in the lecture, let's just briefly discuss what oxalates are. As I mentioned, oxalates are derived, they're in plants. These are compounds that are found in plants to various degrees that actually act as a defense mechanism for the plant. Think about it for just a moment. Every living thing wants to live, of course. The animal has the ability to defend itself or run away. The plant can't run away, and so it does what it can to discourage any potential consumer. And so animals, herbivores, and even insects will often avoid oxalate-rich plants, often because it actually can hurt their mouth. But there are some studies to find that insects that are forced to subsist on oxalate-rich plants have a failure to grow compared to plants that have lower levels of oxalates. So naturally, in nature, the animal or the insect will try to find sources of nutrition that have lower levels of oxalates to prevent some of this malnourishment. Now, let's leave the lower animals and insects behind. In humans, oxalates have been shown to have a unique ability to bind with certain minerals. And that's why we can call them anti-nutrients, because of when this happens in the guts. It'll, of course, compromise the ability of those minerals to get in. And we'll talk about that. All of this is still intro, of course. Now, now that you know generally what the molecule is, let's talk about where they can come from. Well, this is a plant-derived substance. And many plants, especially leafy greens, contain oxalates. So leafy greens are going to be the highest source, like spinach and kale. Beets, certain nuts, seeds, grains, and certain legumes, all of those are going to be sources of oxalates. Now, that is not all legumes, not all grains, it's certain ones. And you could certainly find a list of the most common. But the big problem is the leafy greens. And as I'm going to get to in a little bit, you'll see how that can in fact have very real world implications. Now, even within a single plant, like spinach, not all spinaches are going to have the same level of oxalates. There are a handful of variables that go in to determine how much oxalate a plant is going to have, like the quality of the soil, the specific subspecies, even how ripe the plant is. And so it can be a little difficult to determine exact amounts of oxalates in any given serving of the plant. Now, as much as I am painting the picture or describing oxalates as being sourced exclusively from plants, one interesting quirk of oxalates in the body is that we can make it. So all of the plant sources that I just got done describing would be considered exogenous sources of oxalates. So oxalates coming from outside the body. However, it is possible for you to be getting oxalates at higher levels in your blood because you're making it. Most people don't appreciate that there's a metabolic conversion of vitamin C. So we have an endogenous or from within source of oxalates as well. When vitamin C is metabolized, a portion of it is converted into oxalate as a byproduct. And this occurs naturally, but that does mean the more vitamin C you consume, the more likely it is that your body is producing oxalates. So that is something you do not hear discussed very often. We typically think of it only as being something coming from plants. But mind you, vitamin C mostly comes from plants as well. There is very modest levels of vitamin C in meat, but it is very, very modest. Now, probably enough for the human to be fine on. In fact, evidence would suggest there is, but that's a topic for another time. Don't get me distracted. All right, let's revisit now that we've sort of set the stage and moved through the introduction part of the lecture. Let's revisit that controversial term of anti-nutrient, a way in which a plant tries to discourage animals from eating it, because again, in nature, everything wants to live. And to understand anti-nutrients, it is to appreciate the effect of this molecule on minerals and the absorption of nutrients. So an anti-nutrient is a naturally occurring compound that you find in certain foods, plants, that interfere with the absorption of certain minerals and nutrients, thereby reducing the bioavailability in the body. So it's one thing to eat a given amount of a mineral, but it's another thing for that molecule, that mineral or nutrient, to actually get into the bloodstream. That would be an indication of the bioavailability. So one way in which oxalates act as an anti-nutrient is by binding with calcium. So the interaction here is that oxalates do have a very strong attraction to calcium. And when they bind, it forms this crystal structure called calcium oxalate. Now, calcium oxalate does not play nice with the body. And depending on where this happens, it can create distinct issues. Now, calcium is an interesting molecule here. So as we talk about calcium in the gut, then oxalates are acting as an anti-nutrient. And so when it happens in the gut, which is where it generally would occur, in the digestive tract, then you're eating, that would be like you eating oxalates and eating calcium. And when the two encounter each other, you get that calcium oxalate crystal, which is not bioavailable. You do not absorb that. It stays in the guts. Although it can, as I'm going to touch on later, it can cause inflammation in the gut. You could imagine it almost like a little tumbleweed with thorns rolling through the intestines. Yeah, it's going to go out and you will excrete it in the feces. So it gets excreted in stool or feces rather than being absorbed. But on the way, it's going to kind of scratch the intestine a little bit, if you will. But that does mean you're getting less calcium in, and you do need calcium, as we'll touch on a little later and talk about some of the heart consequences. You really need calcium in the body for proper bone health, nerve function, muscle contraction, skeletal muscle, me animating my arms, as well as, of course, heart muscle. Heart has a tremendous reliance on calcium. All right, now it's not just calcium that is a mineral that gets attacked, if you will, with oxalates, but also magnesium. Oxalates can bind magnesium in the intestines, thereby reducing the bioavailability of this essential mineral. The implications here, once again, is that you can possibly just become a little depleted in your calcium. Or magnesium, rather. We use magnesium in hundreds of enzymatic reactions within the body. But when magnesium binds with the oxalates, it forms magnesium oxalate in the intestines, which is, again, excreted in the stool. This is less of a problem if magnesium and oxalates bind in the blood, just because blood levels of magnesium are so low, unlike calcium levels. So just to go back to calcium for just a second, there's relatively so much more calcium in the blood that if that oxalate actually does get in from the gut, then it's really going to bind calcium in the blood. And we'll get to that's when oxalates becomes a problem in the body. Again, because there's so much calcium in the blood, unlike magnesium, which is fantastically lower levels, and even iron. But iron is the next one, and the last one that we'll discuss. So less pronounced, but still relevant, oxalates can bind iron, thereby affecting iron absorption. This is, of course, particularly non-heme iron. This is the iron that's coming from plants. One of the reasons that the iron from plants is so low with its bioavailability is because when you're eating that plant with iron, it also is often coming with oxalates. And so you're not going to get that iron into your blood. Again, heme iron, the iron that comes from meat, is less susceptible to that binding with oxalates. And moreover, the meat doesn't have oxalates, and so you're not going to be getting them together in the first place. That matters because iron is essential for normal red blood cell function, for example, most especially and most famously. You need iron to bind the oxygen in the hemoglobin portion of the red blood cell, but you also need iron for normal mitochondrial function. While heme iron from animal sources, as I noted, is less affected by oxalates, individuals that are relying on plant-based sources of iron are absolutely more likely to struggle with iron absorption due to the oxalate binding and thereby be at a much higher risk of iron deficiency problems, most especially anemia, most especially for young women. All right. Now, I've already alluded to this, but just to put a fine point on the anti-nutrient part, if you do have this overall reduced mineral bioavailability, people on high oxalate diets, especially those consuming lots of leafy greens, may experience lower bioavailability of calcium and magnesium and iron, and we need all of them. The most at-risk people are going to be people who are eating those foods to a great degree, especially juicing. And I'm going to talk about that specifically when I highlight a case study. But also, I would come back to people who just have higher needs, certainly during pregnancy, certainly during the course of normal menstrual cycles where blood loss is more frequent, and iron replacement is more needed. Now, one interesting thing about calcium, as we're going to get to, the main issue with oxalates in the body, once it actually gets in, is that it binds calcium, and then that becomes problematic. Now you have those thorny tumbleweeds flowing through your blood vessels rather than your gut, and your gut can take a lot of abuse. Your blood vessels, are a little more sensitive to these kinds of attacks. But with that, there's a bit of a paradox with calcium especially. So oxalates reduce calcium absorption, as I noted earlier, and in that sense act as an anti-nutrient. But at the same time, then calcium becomes a potential part of the solution if you have a strategy where you're trying to reduce the oxalates that are coming in, because having adequate calcium in the diet actually can help prevent excessive oxalate absorption. Because remember, calcium binds with oxalates in the gut. This means that they can exit through the stool rather than actually getting absorbed through the wall of the intestines and getting into the bloodstream. So calcium that is consumed through food can bind to oxalates, just to say all of this another way, in the gut, forming the insoluble or the unabsorbable calcium oxalate complexes or crystals, which then just get dumped from the body. And because they're getting dumped from the body, or they're getting dumped from the body because you couldn't absorb them, which is going to be good because of the consequences that we'll talk about in just next, when we think about the problem, like why we want to avoid oxalates in the first place. Indeed, the entire justification for me lecturing you on the topic. All right, now, of course, to flip all of this around, there is a consequence to having a low calcium diet. When dietary calcium is low, oxalates are more likely to be absorbed into the bloodstream, thereby raising the risk of the oxalate-related consequences that we'll get to now. Just by way of relevance, as we go through a very brief list of pathologies or health disorders that are related to oxalates, we'll start with the one that is the most commonly affected, and that is the kidneys. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with the kidneys, just as a personal tangent. Actually born from both my being a professor of physiology and needing to teach systems physiology or various organ systems within the body, including the kidneys, but then balanced with my interest as a metabolic scientist. As you've heard me mention before, kidneys have a metabolic rate that is so fantastically high that it actually becomes difficult to measure the metabolic rate with conventional laboratory tools. Indeed, even the equipment in my own lab. You think of the heart and the brain and muscle tissue as having a high metabolic rate. They're not even in the same stratosphere as the kidney. So on one hand, I have an obsessive interest with the kidney because of its just massively revving metabolic engine. But on the other hand, they are fantastically complicated in their concentration of urine and their handling of salts balanced with water. There's this phenomenon referred to as countercurrent multiplication. Look it up. It's actually a very difficult principle to teach. So as a professor, I sort of groan whenever I have to teach kidney physiology. But as a mitochondrial metabolic scientist, I get a little thrilled because the kidneys are just so unique. They are truly in a category of their own when it comes to metabolism. Nevertheless, let's come back to the kidneys in the context of oxalates. And by now, you can already perhaps anticipate where this is going. When oxalates bind calcium, and calcium is one of the higher levels of mineral or electrolytes, it is an electrolyte in the blood. So when oxalates bind calcium, they form the calcium oxalate crystals, which are the primary composition of almost 80% of all kidney stones. So now you're seeing the issue. So as much as the calcium oxalate is flowing through the bloodstream like a little thistly or thorny tumbleweed, when it gets to the glomerulus, which is the part of the kidney in all of its millions of forms, where you're actually filtering, it can get filtered, but then it starts to get kind of stuck in these little tubules and things, all these little vessels of the kidney that are trying to move what is getting filtered down to the bladder and then from the bladder out. So again, just to reiterate that 80% of all kidney stones are calcium oxalate. So for people that are prone to kidney stones, these crystals can build up in the kidneys and form stones, leading to the, may I never experience this myself, apparently substantial pain and even scarring, such damage to the kidneys resulting in long-term damage. But indeed, I've known extraordinarily stoic individuals who are bent over with tears because the pain of the kidney stone is so substantial. Again, may I never know that discomfort. All right, now what are some of the risk factors for people that you may be thinking of yourself or someone that you know? Let's just chat briefly about the risk factors for oxalate-related kidney stones. So one is actually low dietary calcium. As I mentioned earlier, low calcium intake can increase oxalate absorption, thereby elevating the amount of oxalate that gets into the blood. And once it's in the blood, it can bind with any amount of calcium that is in the blood. Now, I know what you're thinking, which is, well, if you're not eating a lot of calcium, how's there calcium in the blood? There's this constant calcium turnover coming from the bone, actually. So most of the calcium that you have flowing in your blood at any moment is calcium that has been broken down from your bone. Now, ideally, you're eating enough calcium from time to time in the diet that you're building that back up. But bone is not a static tissue. It's not just you build it through puberty and you're done. Not at all. Bone is constantly turning over. And so most of the calcium you have in your blood at any given moment is actually coming from your bone, not necessarily coming from your gut as it's getting absorbed into the bloodstream. All right. Also, poor hydration. Of course, this one's kind of intuitive. If fluid intake is low, it will make the amount of oxalates in the urine more concentrated, which just makes it more likely that you're going to get some crystallization and stone forming. All right. Now, I mentioned earlier the role of vitamin C, and I'll just mention that again. It is possible that a person who's taking very high doses of vitamin C can be making enough of their own oxalates through the normal process of vitamin C metabolism that their oxalates have gotten to a problematic level and now they're forming stones. Now, one comment I'm going to make, and it is absolutely going to pique your interest, which is the role of the gut bacteria. And I'm going to revisit this at the end. So I'm just teasing you for now because it's a little premature to talk more about it, at least the way I wanted the lecture to flow. So there are known populations of bacteria within the gut that can break down oxalates. And so you don't have as much of a chance to absorb it. But people with low levels of these bacteria have been shown to have more likely to absorb oxalates and more likely to have kidney stones. Now, I'm going to come back to that topic in a moment. Before we go any further, I just wanted to highlight a case report that was published in the American Journal of Medicine. In this particular case, the patient developed acute kidney injury. In fact, this form known as oxalate nephropathy. Anytime you hear that nephron, or someone who's a nephrologist is a kidney specialist. But if you hear nephron, you think about that glomerulus, that kind of the business unit of the kidney. And this happened because of a high oxalate consumption. In fact, the title of the case report is kind of funny, and so I have to share it because I like laughing. The title is Oxalate Nephropathy Due to Juicing. That's the title. Oxalate nephropathy, and basically oxalate-induced kidney damage due to juicing. And you can guess what they were juicing. So the patient showed symptoms of systemic inflammation, so high levels of these pro-inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, along with significant impaired kidney function due entirely to a buildup of oxalate crystals within the kidney. In this patient, they found that when dietary modifications were made to reduce oxalate intake, the patient's kidney function began to recover, and markers of the systemic inflammation, the inflammation throughout the body, went down. So the case study highlights how there is a direct effect of high oxalate consumption in the diet, not only impacting kidney health, but also inflammation. And that becomes very relevant when we talk about cardiometabolic health or cardiovascular health in particular in just a moment. But speaking of inflammation, one of the primary sources of inflammation in the blood and thereby the rest of the body is the gut. Now, this is somewhat delving into the realm of speculation. There's not a lot of studies that have focused on this, so please take that for what it's worth. And I always am quick to disclose such moments of speculation because I really just want to rely on the published reports. But there's limited evidence to show that high oxalate intake can damage the gut lining, that when you do have it binding, when the crystals form, it can irritate the cells in the gut lining, potentially weakening the gut barrier. As I've talked about leaky gut before, you have the cells that are abutted tight against one another. And when they start to get a little damaged, like a thorny tumbleweed, then they start to pull apart a bit. And now you have a gap in these little junctions of cell to cell, and now stuff can start to flow through. In other words, more gut permeability, in other words, leaky gut. When the gut becomes more permeable, these substances that are normally locked in the gut can start to get into the bloodstream, interact with the immune system, promote chronic systemic inflammation, like reported in that case study I mentioned a moment ago, and in people who are susceptible can possibly trigger autoimmune responses. So some patients with autoimmune conditions, especially rheumatoid arthritis, report improvements with cutting back oxalates. So low oxalate diets have been shown to be fairly effective with rheumatoid arthritis. And in fact, we'll talk about the joints in just a moment. Before I talk about the joints, actually, let's talk about the joints. That's a good time. Then we'll go back to the heart as the last kind of part of the body that really gets affected by this. Okay, so I just mentioned rheumatoid arthritis. So the oxalate crystals, as much as we are trying to get rid of them and dump them into the urine, although they can crystallize together too much and form a stone, they can also deposit in the synovial fluid, which is the fluid that we have at our joints. It's sort of what's keeping the shoulders, the elbows, the knees, the hips kind of greasy and lets them not have these cranky squeaks, if you will, when the joint is articulating or moving. But when the oxalate crystals are depositing and accumulating in the synovial fluid, that can lead to inflammation and arthritis, especially in patients with conditions with known elevated oxalate levels. And so there have been some case reports, and I'll have a link here, that show that oxalate crystals are, in fact, can be found in the synovial fluid. When a physician does a biopsy of the joint and takes out the fluid from the joint, you can see the oxalate crystals. And as I noted earlier, this has been shown to happen in people not only because of high oxalate consumption, people with kidney disease, so they're not excreting the oxalates very well, but also with high vitamin C consumption. Okay, now let's go back to the heart and finish the kind of pathology side with the heart, and then we'll get into some of the solution as we wrap up. All right, so the oxalates form crystals with calcium, and this can contribute, as noted earlier, to oxidative stress and and inflammation. I mean, as noted earlier, so inflammation and oxidative stress. And this can result in damage, particularly to the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels. As the endothelium is damaged, then macrophages move in. As more macrophages move in, you start to, which is a kind of poster child of the immune system. Then you start to have the formation of the atherosclerotic core, this sort of entity of cells, very active pro-inflammatory cells that starts to form again this core that can grow bigger and bigger, potentially eventually causing the plaque to close off the vessel. Then you have an infarction or a stroke, a heart attack or a stroke, depending on where it happens. There also, as noted earlier, if with more calcium being bound to oxalates, you can reduce the amount of calcium that's available, which can not only impact bone, but also heart. You need a lot of calcium in the heart muscle in order to function properly. So that's another kind of more speculative realm of complication. Okay, so we just got done talking about where oxalates come from, how we eat them, how we can make them, and then why they're a problem in things like the kidney, the gut, the joints, and the heart, or the blood vessels and the heart. All right, now given that these are harmful molecules, surely the body has ways it wants to get rid of it. Yes, of course, first and foremost, it has the kidney pathway where oxalates can be freely filtered and excreted, and then just urinated out. That would be the ideal way. But the moment those oxalates are binding to calcium, then they become more problematic. And so we certainly want to try to limit the amount of oxalates we're eating and or making. Now let's go back to the gut, because when I was preparing some talking points for this lecture, that was a part of this whole story I was totally unaware of. That there are gut bacteria that can degrade oxalates, the most famous being Oxalobacter formigenes, or sometimes just referred to as O. formigenes. This particular bacterium is especially effective at breaking down oxalates and using them as an energy source, so it eats them. And people with high levels of O. formigenes, confirmed through microbiome analysis, have been shown to have lower risk of kidney stones. Interestingly, people who who take antibiotics are more likely to have lower levels. So, O. formigenes, the oxalate clearing bacterium, is highly sensitive to antibiotics. So, if you or the person you're thinking of has frequently been on antibiotics, all the more reason to be very, very careful with oxalate consumption. But just as a tangent, it's sort of a tragic irony that you could imagine, with the best of intentions, a person who frequently is experiencing poor health and is perhaps frequently on antibiotics, they may be thinking, I need to get healthy. I'm going to start juicing, because we've been so led to believe that juicing is such a healthy thing to do. And in the process, they're adding spinach and kale or all these oxalate-rich leafy greens or similar. And well, wouldn't you know it, they're putting themselves in a perfectly terrible position to get way more oxalate than their guts know what to do with. And because they've decimated that particular population of microbiota bacteria, now they can't clear it as well, and it's all getting absorbed. But similarly, just so more on this idea, studies show that people who lack O. formigenes or naturally have lower levels tend to absorb more levels of oxalates. Of course, that's going to increase the risk of kidney stones and the other complications we talked about. So the more O. formigenes we have, the less oxalate we're going to have coming in. Now, O. formigenes is not the only strain. Some of the more common ones, because I'm certain you've never heard of that one, I hadn't. Lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, which are much more common, also much more um, commonly discussed and found in um, probiotic supplements. Also, albeit at a lower level, can metabolize oxalates. So the formigenes is not the only group. Some of the more common ones, like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, also have that potential, and they are much more common, and they are ones that you can supplement with. Okay, so to wrap it all up, and none of this will be particularly surprising because we've touched on this to varying degrees. So, what can you do? First and foremost, just adopt a low oxalate diet. So, focus on the foods that give you all of the nourishment you need while avoiding an anti-nutrient. There's nothing necessary about consuming something that literally falls within the family of anti-nutrient. It is anti-nutrition in your body. So things like eggs, dairy, meat, and even a lot of vegetables, like some cruciferous vegetables like cauliflower or certain fruits like berries, are going to be perfectly fine and have very, very low levels to no levels of oxalate. But if it's an animal food, you know you're fine. With cooking, that can help as well. If you are boiling the high oxalate foods, like you got your spinach, and for some reason you want to boil it. Well, I mean, the reason you would want to boil it is to try to get rid of the oxalates. When you boil it, it actually will leach out the oxalates, and now the oxalates are in the water. Now, that's less helpful if you're boiling it in a soup when you're going to be drinking all those oxalates anyway, then you haven't done any good. But if you're boiling it and then you're getting rid of that water, the remaining oxalates, while still somewhat there, is going to be significantly lower than it would be otherwise. Of course, stay hydrated and make sure you're drinking a lot and urinating frequently if you are someone who is prone to this. And then lastly, as a strategy to help your body with oxalates, consider either probiotic supplements, especially with those more common bacteria that you can get, and then just simply focusing on fermented foods. I am, as you know, such an advocate of consuming fermented foods, and personally have an affection for kefir, or kefir, as we said in Russia back in the day. I love fermented dairy, but I love fermented foods in any form personally, and I can't advocate them enough. All right. So the summary, to wrap all of it up, that having brought us to this point, mentioning the strategies to avoid it. Oxalates are naturally occurring molecules in plants, especially leafy greens and some certain nuts, grains, legumes. They are anti-nutrient in that they can bind minerals like calcium and magnesium and iron and reduce the body's ability to absorb them. Because of that, they can contribute to mineral deficiencies. Because of the propensity of crystallizing with calcium, which is at such a high level mineral in the plasma, it can cause health problems like joint pain, like arthritis conditions, most especially kidney stones. Remember, 80% of all kidney stones are, in fact, calcium oxalate stones. So it's extraordinarily relevant. Also, the potential damage to the gut and even the cardiovascular system. Speaking of the gut, there are certain populations of gut bacteria that can help degrade the oxalates, thereby essentially neutralizing them as you may be consuming them. Then lastly, manage oxalate consumption in the diet, not only the oxalates themselves, but perhaps just being mindful of your vitamin C consumption. If you're one who likes to take a lot of vitamin C because you are convinced it will help your immune system, you may inadvertently be increasing your oxalate burden by making more of your own. All right. Thank you for joining me today in this lecture in the metabolic classroom. I hope that the lecture sheds some light for you on the role of oxalates in health. And I hope, of course, most especially that you've gotten some good information and some useful strategies for managing oxalates in your diet. Until next time, more knowledge, better health.